Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today I'm looking at a bunch of great albums that are turning 50 in 2023. There's a bunch of links down below. Make sure you go check all those out. There's links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merge page, for the Spotify and Apple Music weekly playlist that we put together, and also the Patreon page. Make sure you go check all that out. Of course, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me the old thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So in the last couple of years, I've been doing these videos looking back at albums having a big anniversary release. Last week I did a video about albums turning 25 in 2023. Today I got about a dozen or so albums that are returning 50 this year. And these albums are some of the best in music history. I mean, 1973 was an absolutely incredible year in music. And it seems almost every week there was another iconic album that was being released. And, it's some of my favorite music in music history all came out in 1973. This first one, though, came out on January 5th. It's Aerosmith's self-titled album. I've loved this album ever since I was a kid. I was probably maybe 8 or 9 years old the first time I heard this album and was like instantly sucked into Aerosmith. When I was, I'd say probably from 9, 10 until, probably when I got into punk when I was like a teenager. Aerosmith was probably one of my favorite bands over that period of time. This album, Toys in the Attic, Pump, Permanent Vacation, I just loved all those albums from Aerosmith, and it's really all because of this album. The next album is an incredible album in and of itself. Came out on February 1st. The album is $1 Billion Babies by Alice Cooper. I've been a big Alice Cooper fan also since I was a kid. And, I think it took me a lot longer to get into $1 Billion Babies. Now it's my favorite Alice Cooper album. I've always been more of a fan of like the Alice Cooper band stuff over the solo stuff. But, for a long time, Killer was my favorite. I'd say over the last, 5 or 6 years, $1 Billion Babies has definitely taken over that top spot for me. And it's, it's an album that I think a lot of people know the hits off of here. And, but like there's so much other stuff on this album that makes it such an incredible album. So moving into March, there's an album that was released on March 1st, 1973 that if you've been watching this channel for a while, you probably have already guessed what this album is. It's one that I've long considered the greatest album ever recorded in music history, and one that I probably own more copies of it on vinyl than I probably should. But the album is Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. This was I think, Pink Floyd's like 7th or 8th album. And over the albums that came out before this, Obscured by Clouds and Metal, which are the two albums that came out just prior to Dark Side of the Moon, there was a progression there. You could hear the band building to something, and it really kind of came through on the Dark Side of the Moon. Of course, Alan Parsons was the engineer on this album. They did a lot of stuff on this album that was really kind of groundbreaking in music in 1973, and it's one that, I really can't say enough how important and how incredible this album is to me. So the next album came out on April 17th, 1973, and it's a band that a lot of people I know really kind of love to hate. I know Ian always says they're like the Nickelback of the 70s, which, I still enjoy their music. At least a majority of their music I really like. But the album is Desperado by the Eagles. The Eagles, like I said, they're a band that people love to hate on. They were doing that like country rock thing, I think, really before it got really popular. So I think they were a little bit before their time. But Desperado is probably on the lower end, even though I think all their 70s albums are great albums. I think it's probably on the lower end. There's definitely a couple skippable tracks I can do without on this album that maybe would have made it a little bit of a better album. But, overall, it's a great spin. So on July 6, 1973, an album that was released that I think a lot of people really consider this one of the, if not the best or greatest progressive rock album ever recorded. The album is A Passion Play by Jethro Tull. Maybe I'm a little bit jaded. I'm a Jethro Tull fan. I have been for a long time, but Passion Play, I'm not a progressive rock fan though. And so when Jethro Tull recorded Thick as a Brick, the album before A Passion Play, Thick as a Brick was recorded almost like a joke because a lot of people, critics, when Aqualung was released, felt like they were trying to do a progressive rock album with Aqualung. And the band was like, oh, no, you want to see a progressive rock album? We're going to do Thick as a Brick. Like I said, almost as a joke. And then they recorded A Passion Play. It's an album where you can see they really intended on building this great grand album, over a span of, 40 plus minutes. And it really kind of, and it works. It works in so many different ways. There's so many different, like, intricate parts in A Passion Play that you don't see in a lot of other progressive rock albums, especially in the mid to early part of the 70s. But it's one that if you're unfamiliar with this one, I highly recommend it. It's it might not be right up everyone's alley, but I think if you're a progressive rock fan, you'll love this album. So by 1973, you had this huge boom in arena rock bands, at least like the beginning of the big boom. And this next album might be one of the biggest arena rock bands in rock history. This was released on July 13th, 1973. It is Queen's self-titled debut album, and one that, this is by far not my favorite Queen album. There's, I could do without maybe probably 3 or 4 tracks on this album, but you could see what Queen was going to become on this album. It was just, you could see them laying the groundwork over what they would do over the next really kind of 6 or 7 albums to become that huge band that they would become. Another band that had an incredible debut album in 1973. This was released on August 13th. That album is pronounced Lynyrd Skynyrd by Lynyrd Skynyrd. Looking back on this album, this is the album that introduced the world to Freebird. There's so many great tracks on here. This really could have been a greatest hits album in and of itself. Every single track on here is well known by Lynyrd Skynyrd fans. And Lynyrd Skynyrd was, one of those bands that were kind of carrying on that Southern rock feel in the early to mid part of the 70s that, I think really kind of trailed off as you got later into the 70s. But the stuff that Lynyrd Skynyrd was doing in the early part of that decade is just unbelievable. And it's I'm not even a big Lynyrd Skynyrd fan. I'm not a big Southern rock fan. But this is just an incredible album. The next 2 albums are easily albums I'd put in my top 10 favorite albums of all time. This first one, released August 31st, 1973, Goat's Head Soup by the Rolling Stones. Probably not the most popular Rolling Stones album. I think Angie was the only really big hit off this album. But this is an album that, you could take Angie off here and it would still be an unbelievable album. There's so many other tracks on here. The Rolling Stones were really, I think in 73, really kind of hitting their stride musically. And, it's just an album where you can see a band at their absolute peak. And then the other album that I'd put in my top 5 or top 10, released on October 5th, 1973, it's Goodbye Yellow Brick Road by Elton John. I think this is absolute peak Elton John. This is the best that he ever sounded on any of his albums. But it's an album that probably took me a little bit longer to get into than maybe some of his later stuff. Being a kid in the late 80s, early 90s, I was definitely into a different kind of rock music. And, when it came to like older rock, I would get into like Kiss and Led Zeppelin, The Doors and things like that. But it wasn't really until probably the last 15 years maybe that I started getting more and more into Elton John stuff. I remember the first time I listened to this album, I was absolutely blown away by it. And I felt kind of dumb for, not being a fan of it for the last, 40 years. But it's definitely one of those top 10 albums for me. The next album is one that I could probably do without the title track. It's one of those, it's not that it's a bad track. It's just that it's one of those like overplayed tracks that's been played way too much over the last 50 years. The album came out on November 9th, 1973. It is Piano Man by Billy Joel. Like I said, it's a great album. It's a great song, but I've heard it played more than probably any other or almost any other song over the last, 40 plus years of my life. But it is a really good album and one that, like I said, I could probably do without that track, but there's so many other great ones on here that make this album what it really is. So Alice Cooper was having a great time in 1973. Beginning part of the year, releases Billion Dollar Babies, and then on November 20th, releases his other great album from that year, Muscle of Love. And it's, this is an album that I think a lot of fans are kind of up and down on. But it's one that I'd probably put it in my top 3 or 4 Alice Cooper albums overall. And then last but not least on the list, album that came out on December 1st, 1973, and in my opinion is one of the, maybe the best heavy metal album ever recorded. That album, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath by Black Sabbath. This is an album that, really, if you compare it to other Black Sabbath albums, say, Paranoid or Volume 4, which are like the two really big albums that everyone knows and loves, there's a lot of big hit singles off of those albums that everyone knows, and there really isn't off of Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. And then maybe that's what kind of sets it aside. I think Sabbath Bloody Sabbath was the only single that was ever released off of this album. But really, like, beginning to end, it's just an unbelievable adventure that Black Sabbath kind of laid out there. And it, I think as far as like heavy metal albums go, it's the absolute pinnacle. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. It's fun to kind of look back at these albums, that were released. 1973, that was 6 years before I was born. So it's fun to kind of look back at these albums, celebrating a huge milestone this year. Like I said, some of these albums are, I would easily put in my top 10 albums of all time. Just unbelievable music for an unbelievable year. But drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me the old thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. And that's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.